Let me be direct with you from the outset because what has happened in the last 72 hours is not a skirmish. It is not a provocation. And it is most certainly not the story that every major Western outlet is currently telling you. Everyone is talking about Israel's response. Everyone is debating the missile counts and the interception rates and which side landed more blows. But that is not the real story. The real story is what happened before any missile was fired. The real story is what went dark. Because somewhere over the skies of the eastern Mediterranean and the northern Persian Gulf region, something turned off. Radar arrays that have been running continuously for years, systems that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to build and maintain, systems that Israel, the United States, and their regional partners have always counted on as an absolute ceiling of situational awareness, went silent. Not jammed in the conventional sense, not degraded or partially blinded, silent. And in the window that followed, Iran launched. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what an electromagnetic pulse weapon system of this class means for modern air defense architecture, why the failure of the Iron Dome in this engagement was not a malfunction, but a mathematical inevitability, and why what we are watching unfold right now will permanently alter the strategic balance in the Middle East. Not for months, for decades. This analysis is based on reporting from Jane's Defense Weekly, the Financial Times, and multiple technical assessments from former U.S. Air Force electronic warfare specialists. Stay with me. Let us start with geography and physics, because both of them matter enormously here, and neither of them has been explained properly by anyone covering this story in the mainstream press. Israel's layered air defense system, Iron Dome, David's Sling, and the Arrow systems, operates on a fundamental principle. Every layer depends on radar. Radar detects the incoming projectile. Radar calculates the trajectory. Radar guides the interceptor. Remove the radar and you do not degrade the system. You blind it completely. This is not a vulnerability that Israeli engineers overlooked. It is an inherent physical dependency that no amount of engineering can eliminate. The question has always been whether any adversary could credibly threaten that radar network across the entire engagement envelope simultaneously. Iran, according to reporting by Jane's Defense Weekly and corroborated by analysis from the Middle East Eye Defense Desk, has been developing what is formally classified as a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse delivery system, not a nuclear EMP, which requires a nuclear warhead detonated at altitude, but a directed energy EMP system capable of generating focused electromagnetic pulses over a geographically defined area. The distinction matters enormously. A nuclear EMP is indiscriminate and would constitute an act of war with civilizational consequences. A directed conventional EMP is a precision military tool, and precision military tools get used. Former U.S. Air Force electronic warfare officer Colonel David Deptula, in a 2024 assessment published by the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, described this class of weapons as, and I am quoting him directly here, the single most underappreciated threat vector in modern air defense planning. He was not speaking hypothetically. He was describing a capability gap that NATO and its partners had identified but had not adequately addressed. Subscribe now if you are watching this and realizing you have not been getting this level of technical analysis anywhere else. Because what I am about to walk you through in the next section is going to change how you understand everything that happened after the radar went dark. Announcement number 1, the EMP activation window and what it accomplished. According to reporting cross-reference between the Financial Times and Israeli defense correspondent Amos Harel writing in Haaretz, the electromagnetic disruption event preceded the Iranian missile salvo by approximately 4 to 7 minutes. 4 to 7 minutes. In the context of air defense operations, that is not a short window. That is an eternity. Iron Dome batteries require continuous radar contact to engage targets. Without that contact, the interceptor missiles cannot be guided. They become, in effect, expensive debris. The Iranian launch that followed involved an estimated 450 ballistic and cruise missiles fired over a 10-minute window, according to assessments from the Institute for the Study of War and confirmed in broad terms by statements from the Israeli Defense Forces. Now, I want you to understand what 450 missiles in 10 minutes actually means mathematically. Iron Dome, in its standard operational configuration, has a theoretical maximum intercept rate of approximately 10 to 15 incoming threats per battery per minute. Israel operates an estimated 10 to 14 active Iron Dome batteries at any given time. That gives you a theoretical maximum of 140 to 210 intercepts per minute at peak performance. Against a saturated salvo of 450 missiles arriving simultaneously, even without any radar degradation, the system faces an arithmetic deficit. With radar degraded or blinded in the critical opening minutes, the deficit becomes catastrophic. This is not a failure of Israeli engineering. This is not negligence. This is what strategic saturation looks like when it is executed correctly. And Iran, whatever else one thinks about its political leadership, has been studying this problem for 20 years. Received. That is announcement number one. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes, and where the Western media's coverage becomes not just incomplete, but actively misleading. Announcement number two, Israel's response and what it reveals about the new strategic reality. Within 6 hours of the Iranian strike, Israel launched what its military described as a comprehensive retaliatory operation targeting Iranian military infrastructure, including air defense sites, missile production facilities, and what Israeli sources described as EMP weapon storage and development locations in the western Zagros mountain range. Here's what the mainstream coverage has almost entirely missed. According to a technical briefing reported by Breaking Defense and sourced to 3 former U.S. defense officials who spoke on background, the Israeli strikes targeting the alleged EMP facilities were only partially successful. Of the estimated 12 locations designated as high-priority targets related to Iran's directed energy program, Israeli forces were able to confirm damage at 7. 5 remain either intact or with damage status unknown. I want you to stay with that number. 5 facilities potentially associated with Iran's electromagnetic pulse weapon program that are either intact or unaccounted for. In military planning, that is not a partial success. That is an ongoing threat that has not been neutralized. The Financial Times defense correspondent reported on the day following the exchange that U.S. officials privately expressed frustration to their Israeli counterparts that the targeting list had been, in their assessment, insufficiently comprehensive. The report noted that one senior American official had indicated the operation had addressed the symptom without resolving the underlying capability. This matters because of what it implies about the next engagement. Iran has demonstrated the weapon works. Iran has demonstrated the launch doctrine that follows. And Iran has now seen Israel's targeting priorities clearly enough to understand which facilities were considered most threatening and which were not. Announcement number 3, and this is the one that almost nobody in the Western press is connecting correctly. The countries watching this exchange most carefully are not in the Middle East. They are in East Asia. Taiwan's defense ministry, according to reporting by Reuters, immediately convened an emergency working group to assess the implications of the radar blackout event for their own air defense architecture. Taiwan's situation is in some respects analogous, a sophisticated layered air defense system that is fundamentally radar-dependent, facing a potential adversary, China, that has been investing heavily in electronic warfare and directed energy capabilities. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff issued an internal assessment, portions of which were reported by Yonhap News Agency, noting the event as a significant operational data point for their own contingency planning against North Korean electronic warfare threats. And the United States Sixth Fleet, which maintains a continuous naval presence in the eastern Mediterranean, immediately repositioned 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with the most advanced Aegis radar systems currently deployed, according to U.S. Naval Institute tracking data. The repositioning of those destroyers tells you everything. When the United States moves Aegis-equipped ships to a theater immediately following an electromagnetic disruption event, it is not doing so as a symbolic gesture. It is doing so because its own planners understand exactly what the absence of functional radar means, and they are trying to restore it. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are 2 stories playing out simultaneously, and the Western media establishment is covering only one of them. The story they are covering is the kinetic exchange. Missiles fired, missiles intercepted, damage assessed, statements issued. This is the story that generates clicks and fills the cable news cycle. It is not unimportant, but it is the surface. The story they are not covering adequately is the doctrinal shift. Iran has now publicly demonstrated, in a live operational environment against one of the most sophisticated air defense networks ever built, that the EMP first strike doctrine works. Before this engagement, that doctrine was theoretical. Military analysts knew the theory. Defense contractors had been warning about it for years, but it had not been tested at scale against a real adversary's real systems. Now it has been, and the implications extend far beyond Iran and Israel. Think carefully about what this represents. Every nation that currently relies on a radar-dependent air defense system, and that is essentially every nation on Earth, has just watched a live demonstration that those systems have an exploitable vulnerability that cannot be engineered away with existing technology. The response to that realization is not a week of cable news coverage and then back to normal. The response to that realization is a fundamental reassessment of air defense architecture that will cost hundreds of billions of dollars and take a decade to implement. Meanwhile, the nations that have invested in EMP-capable systems now know their investment was not wasted. Russia, China, North Korea, all of which have been reported by U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency assessments to be pursuing similar capabilities, have just received a real-world validation of the strategic concept they have been investing in. Bloomberg reported within 48 hours of the exchange that defense stocks related to electronic warfare and radar hardening technology surged by an average of 14% in a single trading session. The market understood the implication before the political commentary class did. And here is the part of this story that the Western governments find most uncomfortable. The same governments that have spent the last decade dismissing Iranian military capability as overstated, as more theater than substance, as the posturing of an isolated regime with an aging military, those same governments are now quietly rushing to convene classified briefings about what their own radar systems would look like if subjected to the same conditions. They have always known this vulnerability existed. They chose to emphasize other aspects of the strategic picture because acknowledging it would have been politically inconvenient. That is not a conspiracy. That is what governments do. They emphasize what supports their preferred policy and minimize what complicates it. The job of serious analysis is to look at the full picture. This pattern, a smaller, isolated actor using asymmetric technology to neutralize a structural advantage held by a much larger power, is not new. History has seen it before, and every time it has been seen before, the outcome has followed the same fundamental logic. The most instructive historical parallel here is not Thermopylae. It is the German U-boat campaign in the North Atlantic between 1940 and 1943. Britain and the Allied powers had an enormous structural advantage in surface naval power. Germany had no meaningful surface fleet capable of challenging that advantage directly. So German Naval Command, under Admiral Karl Dönitz, developed a doctrine of asymmetric maritime warfare using submarines, a technology both sides possessed but which Germany chose to prioritize and deploy differently. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied ships. For a period of approximately 18 months, the entire strategic basis of the Allied war effort, which depended on transatlantic supply lines, was under genuine existential threat. Not because Germany had more ships. Because Germany had developed a doctrine that exploited a specific vulnerability in how its adversary operated, and had invested in the specific tool required to exploit that vulnerability at scale. Iran is not Nazi Germany. The moral parallel is not what I am drawing. The strategic logic parallel is, a state that cannot compete symmetrically identifies a specific vulnerability in its adversary's system architecture, invests in the asymmetric tool required to exploit it, develops a doctrine for its use, and then demonstrates it publicly in a way that cannot be dismissed or explained away. The demonstration changes the strategic calculus not just for the immediate adversary, but for every other actor watching. The Allies eventually neutralized the U-boat threat. It took them 3 years, enormous losses, and the development of better sonar, convoy tactics, and long-range anti-submarine aircraft. The point is not that the asymmetric advantage was permanent. The point is that it was real, consequential, and could not simply be dismissed through statements about overall technological superiority. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths forward, because the situation has now resolved into genuinely distinct scenarios, and there is no honest way to obscure that. Path 1: controlled de-escalation. This is the scenario in which back-channel diplomacy, Qatari, Omani, or direct American intermediary contact with Iranian leadership produces some form of mutual de-escalation agreement over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Both sides have demonstrated what they needed to demonstrate. Iran has proven the EMP doctrine. Israel has demonstrated its willingness to strike deep into Iranian territory. A tacit understanding emerges that further escalation carries unacceptable risks for both parties. This outcome requires significant concessions in private that neither side would acknowledge publicly. It is possible. It requires political will that I am not certain exists in this precise moment. Path 2, Iranian second strike. This is the scenario in which Iran, assessing that the demonstrated capability has not produced sufficient political concessions, no meaningful change in sanctions posture, no reduction in Israeli pressure on its regional network, decides to conduct a second, more targeted strike. Not another mass salvo. A precision demonstration against specific high-value infrastructure targets. The strategic logic would be to show that the first event was not a one-time capability, but an established, repeatable doctrine. This path carries significant escalation risk. An Israeli or American response to a second Iranian strike would almost certainly be qualitatively different from the response to the first. Path 3, the slow leverage strategy. This is the scenario I find most consistent with Iranian strategic behavior over the past 20 years. Iran does not escalate kinetically. Instead, it uses the demonstrated EMP capability as permanent leverage in every subsequent diplomatic, economic, and proxy engagement. The threat of using the capability again becomes more valuable than the capability itself. Israel and the United States are forced to expend enormous resources on radar hardening and electronic countermeasures that will take years to fully deploy. During that window, Iran's relative military position improves simply because its adversaries are spending down their own strategic margins to close a vulnerability that Iran has already exploited once. I think we are on path 3, but the next 48 hours will tell us a great deal. Watch the diplomatic channels. Watch whether the Qatari Foreign Ministry announces travel to Tehran. Watch whether there are any reports of back-channel contacts through the Swiss embassy in Tehran. Those indicators will tell you with more honesty than any press briefing what path this conflict is actually following. Tell me in the comments which scenario you believe is most likely and what angle you think the mainstream coverage is missing most severely. We will keep tracking every development in this theater. Subscribe now, share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is actually happening in the Middle East. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next one.